Hi, everyone. My name is Alex Schober, and today I'm going to be walking you through our Peru outlook for 2021. I'm the senior analyst for the Southern Cone, and with me is Mariana Cepeda, who is an analyst for the Latin American research team as well. Mariana, it's good to have you.
Thank you, Alex. It's great to talk to you.
Thank you. So basically, the idea of this quick presentation is to give everyone a brief idea of how we're seeing Peru's outlook for 2021. We're going to start a little bit talking about the COVID-19 situation, where Peru stands on vaccinations, what we can expect from the external standpoint as well. We'll second talk about some of Peru's unique challenges and opportunities. Finally, we'll do some scenarios where we see our economic forecasts for Peru for the next couple of years, as well as FX and other economic indicators. And then finally, some business implications where I'll talk a little bit about consumer spending in particular, and how we see that evolving in Peru. So getting started with COVID-19, the first thing for us to see here is that Peru is clearly battling a second wave of the coronavirus and has been battling this second wave of the coronavirus really since the beginning of the year. I think that this was something that we were very much expecting, in the sense that if we were remembering what was happening to Europe, to the United States, they clearly have gone through second and third waves at times as well. And usually what happens in the United States and Western Europe has preceded what has happened in Latin America. So it's not a huge surprise that we're seeing a second wave out of Peru. It's a little unfortunate because Peru was hit very hard by the coronavirus pandemic at the beginning of last year. The middle of last year was one of the worst hit countries in the world. So this is something that is definitely going to be top of mind for executives over the course of the year. I think the main question that really comes from this, from an executive lens, is will we see new national lockdowns in 2021? The short answer to this question is no. And the reason why that's the case is because you can see here that Peru locked down harder than arguably any other country in Latin America, maybe besides Argentina, during the midst of the pandemic. Back in May, April, June, you basically saw the entire country and all the economic apparatus shut down. And this caused Peru to have one of the worst recessions in the region last year, one of the worst recessions in the world. So it kind of, the first argument of this is that it's politically unpopular because of how bad the economy was hit last year. The second thing is to say that we will probably still see some stop and go with social distancing measures over the course of the year. We already saw this a little bit with the stricter restrictions in the Lima metro area and a few other areas of Peru over the course of the year, which you can see on this chart on the Oxford Stringency Index, with Peru's stringency going up a little bit. So overall, this is something that we should expect over the course of the year, but a national lockdown seems relatively unlikely. However, I think what will end up dictating this, and the key signpost to watch for how social distancing measures and the economic reopening go over the course of the year, is how Peru does end up vaccinating the population, how fast, I should say, Peru ends up vaccinating its population. Clearly, this is an area where Peru is lagging vis-a-vis other Latin American countries. You can see that Chile is the clear winner here, having vaccinated even more people than the United States as a percentage of 100 people at this point, which is extremely impressive. But Peru is still lagging behind, hasn't even reached 2% of the population yet. And in fact, along with Colombia, it's the major market in Latin America that has vaccinated the least amount of people. This isn't to say that the story couldn't change over the course of the year, but current progress suggests to us that we probably won't see herd immunity out of Peru until probably the first quarter or the second quarter of 2022, which is a little bit later than a couple other countries on this chart, and definitely later than Chile, which we expect to happen probably by the beginning of the fourth quarter of this year. So overall, again, this is a question of timing. I don't think that we're going to see the same pace or the same slow pace for Peru's vaccination over the course of the year, but it is something that the Peruvian government will need to prioritize. The good news, though, is that Peru clearly has enough vaccines to reach this herd immunity. We are defining herd immunity as 80% of the population receiving both doses of a vaccine, if applicable. And you can see that Peru has secured enough vaccines to inoculate 80% of the population, with another 59% pending under negotiation And right now, this portfolio is pretty diverse, with Sinovac being one of the main contributors so far. But Peru is also a beneficiary of the COVAX initiative, and it's something that will continue to improve from Peru. And over the course of the year, we should expect the pace to pick up. I think the one thing that's in this chart that is not necessarily um, showing us the reality of the situation is the timing of when the Peruvian government signed some of these vaccines, because the Sagasti administration signed a lot of these agreements really over the last month and a half, 2 months, whereas Chile had a lot of these vaccination agreements locked up at the end of last year. Argentina did as well. So this is something that I think is potentially showing this slow progress that we saw on the previous slide, with Peru only having vaccinated a little over 1% of its population, is just because they didn't really have a lot under contract until pretty recently. So again, that's the good news. The other side of the coin is that this is explaining why the vaccination process has started a little bit slower. And over the course of the year, this is going to be a key thing to watch as Peru manages the containment of potential secondary or tertiary waves of the coronavirus, and also how fast it can vaccinate its population. Mariana, any questions or comments about anything that I've said so far?
No questions so far. Thank you, Alex.
Excellent. So the other side of the coin here, if you recall to our analysis from last year, basically we expected the economic outlook for every country in Latin America to really come down to the stringency and length of their lockdowns, and also the size of fiscal and monetary stimulus. And Peru was first in the region as far as fiscal stimulus as a percentage of GDP last year, as per IMF data. This is something that we should not expect to be repeated in 2021. 15% of GDP is a massive fiscal stimulus. Peru's fiscal stimulus was a lot of credit-related initiatives, especially for small, medium, and large-sized businesses. Some cash payouts, some moratoria on debts, but it wasn't anything that was quite as similar as Brazil's direct payouts to consumers. So that's just something to keep in mind, that even though Peru's stimulus was large, it was very different than many other stimulus packages on here. So the good thing is that Peru does have fiscal capacity to potentially have another wave of stimulus, which they already did with a minor cash payment that came about when they had their new stringency measures in the Lima metro area in January. But we're probably not going to expect anywhere close to 15% of GDP this year, which makes us believe that, again, the political appetite for a national lockdown is likely pretty low. The other reason why that's the case is that stimulus is clearly not cemented a job recovery. You can see here that the Lima metro area, which is the best proxy for national data for Peru, has seen a decent recovery of the labor market and total employment, but has seen a bit of a flattening out and even a dip in January of 2021 when we did see those new restrictions in Lima. So this is definitely something to watch, because we're clearly still probably 10% lower of total employment of where we were at back in January 2020, which means that there's still several million people who are left without a job. And if we think about the net losses from the pandemic, we're still about 1 million jobs less, or formally employed less, than where we were back in January 2020. So there's still a lot of jobs to be gained. And this is something that's definitely to be very much impacting the consumer spending story, but also the social and political panorama. And I think this could end up causing a bit of social discontent over the next couple of months if there isn't a more full-fledged job recovery to take place. You can see here that this is starting to have a pretty big impact on disposable income. You can see that average real wages for Lima have fallen by over 10% in several months towards the end of 2020 and going into 2021. This is definitely causing, again, lower consumer spending potential, but as well as social discontent potentially if this real wage story does not turn around. This will be very contingent on the labor market recovery. Once we start getting jobs to recover, then you'll start seeing wages recover. But to get jobs to recover, we need investment. And the one thing that I'll mention about investment is that at least if we're looking at small and medium-sized businesses, and of course in Peru, small and medium-sized employment takes up a huge share of overall employment for the country. You can see that for some of these small and medium-sized businesses, if we're referring to this Facebook survey that polls small and medium-sized businesses all around the world, you can see that many of them are having liquidity issues. In fact, Peru, at least if we're just grouping these liquidity issues that are highlighted, have had slightly more problems or expect slightly more problems in the next few months with liquidity-related issues than other countries on here, such as Brazil and Argentina. And this is something that is going to be important with regards to new investments. So if you're having liquidity issues now, then it seems unlikely that you're going to expand your investment capacity, purchase more plant and equipment, really increase CapEx or even increase OpEx as well if you're having liquidity-related issues. So that's going to constrain the investment recovery at least a little bit until the economy starts to pick back up. The other issue, which we're going to talk a lot more about in the next part of the presentation, is politics. As all of you know, we do have presidential elections taking place in April. We have legislative elections taking place at the exact same time. And if last year was any precedent to the state of politics in Peru with former President Vizcarra getting impeached, we should expect the risk of social unrest to stay pretty elevated, especially if we recall what I was showing you in the previous slides about the job market recovery and how it has stalled out. I think that could end up being one cause of social discontent over the course of the year. I don't think we'll necessarily see similar levels of protests that we saw in Chile, more like just regionally focused protests or union focused protests. But nevertheless, we should expect and be on guard for moderating the social situation over the course of the year as it pertains to that job market recovery as well as these elections. Lastly, if there's anything that could really fill the void right now with regards to investments, I mentioned that the private investment story is a little bit precarious. However, public investment has been a huge vehicle for Peru's economic recovery, especially in the second half of 2020. And even if we're looking into 2021, although you can see a bit of a decline here, it's a decline from about a 20% increase. So spending at the national, regional, and local levels on capital expenditures is still pretty high. The new budget for 2021 contemplates a pretty significant increase in public works projects. So we should expect this to be a pretty big driver of recovery. It'll be important for us to monitor this public investment metric over the course of the year. That being said, it's clear in Peru that we have seasonality with public investment execution. Usually around elections, we have a little bit less money executed in the budgets for capital works. So we should probably expect there to be a bit of a dip here in April and May, potentially even June, as the new governments start to come in and take office. But the second half of the year is definitely ripe for a significant amount of public investment in Peru, especially as the economy starts to reopen. And as I said earlier, as governments start to take their office. All of this wrapped up is that we should probably expect a relatively bumpy year. And obviously the vaccination process and the gradual lifting of social distancing measures are assumed in our forecast, so much so that you can see Peru having a little bit of a decline in quarter-on-quarter terms in the first quarter of this year and relatively flat growth in Q2 of 2021, both because of the vaccination process and how it's been relatively slow so far, but more importantly, because of those elections that take place in April. In those elections, we most certainly expect a runoff. So overall, it's going to be a relatively uncertain Q2 of this year before Q3 and Q4 start having more recovery as we have more political certainty for the country over the next couple of over the second half of the year. So before I move on to some of Peru's unique challenges and opportunities, Mariana, I wanted to ask again if you had any questions or doubts, concerns.
Yes, so I was impressed to see how big Peru's fiscal package was last year as a percent of GDP. And something that you mentioned is that Peru has a bit more fiscal space than other countries in the region to potentially respond again with another round of stimulus, albeit more limited this year. So what are the factors that, I guess, why did Peru enter this crisis with in a much stronger fiscal position than what we're seeing in a lot of other countries?
Good question. So Peru has practiced very prudent macroeconomic policy and fiscal policy for a long time. Chile is in a similar position where during the commodity super cycle from the early 2000s through basically the beginning of the 2010s, with a couple of ebbs and flows along that way, Peru practiced what we call countercyclical fiscal policy, which basically was that they weren't doing fiscal stimulus during the boom periods of the 2000s and the early 2010s. Chile was doing the same thing, and because of this, Peru was able to save up a lot of money. They had an emergency fund, similar to how Chile has an emergency fund. Unfortunately, Peru effectively liquidated this emergency funds, financing the fiscal stimulus package from last year. But it really just comes down to the fact that they've kept pretty manageable levels of debt, pretty manageable levels of fiscal deficits, and oftentimes fiscal surpluses. And because of that, they did have the rainy day fund to finance that fiscal spending package. And because of the fact that they were pretty low on their debt load, they were able to issue new bonds last year at a very low rate. So the cost of debt for the country is low, and really this is just making it easier for Peru to finance things over the course of over the year. And if Peru wanted to do the same thing in 2021, theoretically they could, but I think it would be a pretty big risk from a credit rating agency standpoint if they had another massive fiscal stimulus of the same size as last year.
Great. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And just one quick follow-up, and this may be something that you address later in the presentation, but I was curious to hear what some of the fiscal stimulus measures looked like for Peru. I know you mentioned a lot of them were credit-based, which is interesting, but I'm more curious to hear about some of the ones that might have impacted consumers more directly.
Yes. So Peru had a couple of one-off bonuses that they paid to the more vulnerable households of the country. It wasn't a monthly transfer like how Brazil's was a monthly transfer. And they also had bank or government-backed loans for consumers to take at a low interest rate, which unfortunately not many consumers ended up taking advantage of, as I'll show you later on in the presentation. And lastly, this isn't necessarily directly calculated in the fiscal stimulus package calculation, but the Peruvian government also allowed a couple of different pension payouts as well, similar to how Chile did. So that had a huge impact on consumption in the second half of 2020. But overall, those were kind of the main things that Peru focused on, alongside a couple of debt freezes that were approved towards the end of last year.
All right, thank you.
Awesome. So looking a little bit towards Peru's unique challenges and opportunities, and I do want to preface this by saying that there are some pretty big risks on the horizon in Peru, but there are also some reasons for us to be optimistic. So I don't want this conversation to be purely optimistic or purely pessimistic, because there are both sides of the coin here, and we need to weigh which of those two things will have, a bigger net impact. But I digress. If we're looking a little bit more about Peru's recent economic performance, basically you'll see that Peru was hit extremely hard by the pandemic. Peru was probably the worst hit country in Latin America in terms of GDP last year. In Latin America, and one of the worst hit in the world for that matter, the 30% drop that we saw in the second quarter of 2020 is unprecedented, and one of the biggest recessions that the region has ever seen in percentage terms. And one thing I'll say is that it's good to see that once the economy reopened, we did see a pretty decent recovery on quarter terms, and in the fourth quarter, we also saw like a pretty light recession in comparison to even the first quarter of 2020. A lot of this was led by government spending, as you correctly alluded to with the fiscal stimulus package. We're starting to see a little bit of a recovery of exports as well, and private consumption from the pension payouts. So this is good momentum going into 2021. I think the thing that's concerning, however, is how the current social restrictions will potentially affect this recovery process. So far, what we're seeing is decent momentum across most industries. I think this is important for me to clarify because at the beginning, we only really saw recovery from a couple of different industries. Mining, once mines started back opening up, and we are still seeing construction really on the floor, so to speak. But now we're starting to see construction actually grow in annualized terms. You're seeing manufacturing grow in annualized terms. Commerce is doing pretty well. Extractives are still doing really well. The only area that there's still quite a bit of room to make up is other services, which would mostly equate to tourism and the leisure industry, in my opinion. And as you know, Peru really does rely a lot on the tourism industry, and their borders have been mostly closed. And even during the first few months of this year, when we had new restrictions, internally domestic travel was also disrupted. So overall, the tourism industry, it'll probably take another year or two to recover. And that's something that is not recovering at the same pace as the overall economy. But that isn't something for us to be maybe too worried about the long term, because tourism will eventually come back. If we're looking at confidence indicators, I think it's important for us to keep in mind that Peru historically has very high consumer confidence. And anything that's above 50 here constitutes optimism. Anything below 50 is pessimism. And you can see that business confidence took a pretty big hit during the worst of the pandemic last year. And you started to see a bit of a recovery during 2020. And demand expectations, forward-looking demand expectations, which is the dark blue line, did start to become optimistic again towards the second half of the year. But once we saw new social restrictions imposed, we did see a little bit of a bump again. So I think it's important for us to keep in mind that it's not just going to be jobs that are going to be directly tied to the on and on, or the on again, off again social distancing measures, but also consumer business confidence and how that impacts domestic investment. So again, it is improving, but we should expect this to take a couple more months to get back to the full levels that they were at before the pandemic. In the meantime, if we're going to talk about opportunities, an export-led recovery is clearly the most promising and immediate opportunity for the Peruvian economy. You can see on the chart on the left that copper prices are really at their highest levels since the last 10 years. Ever since really the peak of the commodity super cycle in 2010 and 2011, have we seen copper prices this high? And I think this is one area where we can say with a decent amount of confidence that we were wrong about. I think when the pandemic started, we were thinking about how China would recover, about how infrastructure and manufacturing would recover. And we thought, okay, commodity prices are probably going to stay only slightly above where they are right now. Little did we know that copper prices would effectively double over the course of the year. And this has also taken place a lot with gold as well. Maybe not as much as it has happened with some of the more cyclical commodities like copper, oil, and soy. Gold is more used as a hedge and is seen, in the financial markets as a different kind of asset than copper, oil, and soy. But I should mention that Peru does export a lot of gold, which is something that you can see on the right side here. Overall, you've seen these mining export revenues really surge subsequently. And one thing that I think I should also point out here is that if we're looking at where mining exports were during the worst of the pandemic in April and May and June of 2020, you basically saw mining exports really collapse. And the reason why this was the case is because during the pandemic, the social restrictions dictated that many of the copper mines stopped producing. And this was something that was actually quite different than what happened in Chile, where the copper mines did keep producing, and Chile was able to take advantage of the high copper prices and copper exports, whereas Peru is still kind of playing catch up. This does offer opportunities looking forward, though. because of the fact that copper prices are still rising and are staying elevated, there's opportunity for a pretty significant exports-led recovery in Peru. We're probably going to see a record year with regards to mining exports. And it wouldn't be surprising to me to see a couple months of mining exports that are over 100% year on year, just based on where we were at certain points in 2020. So those consumers that live in mining producing regions, or any businesses that cater directly or indirectly with the mining industry, are clearly two customer segments to target in 2021 as these commodity prices remain so high. The other impact of high commodity prices is on the currency. However, the irony of all of this is that we have not seen the impact of high copper prices positively impact the sol up until this point. In fact, we've actually seen the sol depreciate by a pretty substantial amount, to the point where it's at a current all-time high in terms of its rate against the US dollars. I guess that's a little bit of a confusing way of putting this, because it is technically at an all-time low in terms of its weakness against the US dollar. And this is very unprecedented, because usually the central bank keeps a pretty tight hold on the value of the Peruvian sol. And I can say that this is almost entirely due to political uncertainty. You can see the big spike that we had because of the coronavirus pandemic, but also we're kind of moving along this line here where it depreciates even more in the summer months in the Northern Hemisphere in July, August, and September of 2020. A lot of this was during the peak of the political uncertainty that we saw last year. And this has only continued to depreciate as we've gone into 2021. On the eve of the elections, when there's still a lot of uncertainty of who's going to win the elections and which political party, if any, are going to control Congress. So overall, this has really been kind of a confusing phenomenon, because if we compare this to other major commodity exporters in the region, again, to use Chile as an example, Chile recovered all of its lost ground on the Chilean peso last year because of copper almost exclusively. Meanwhile, the sol is continuing to weaken. Looking forward, we do expect that after the elections, we'll likely see a pretty decent strengthening of the sol based on the copper dynamics and the economic recovery. It is at, again, a level where it has not been before, and it seems unlikely that we're going to continue this weakness amid such a surging copper environment. That being said, the political uncertainty is clearly the thing that's dragging down the value of the sol, and it's causing the sol to continue to depreciate, and it is outweighing the fundamentals of copper and domestic demand. So again, it's to probably be a tale of two halves of this year, with the sol being a lot stronger in the second half of the year. But if we do see a more favorable outcome to the elections, then potentially we see a quicker recovery, and this all-time high rate of the sol, in other words, all-time weak level of the sol, does begin to revert pretty quickly. Any questions on anything I've said up until this point, Mariana?
Yes, I was curious to hear as well what your view is on inflation in 2021.
Sure. So inflation in Peru has been probably the lowest in Latin America. Inflation for most of last year was less than 2%. And we still have only seen a little bit of a pickup in inflation as the economy reopens. Overall, we do expect inflation to be a little bit higher in 2021 than it was in 2020. But I think the big problem with inflation, or creating more inflation in Peru right now, is that the job market is still so weak. And you're not getting any of that wage-related inflation that you're getting, that you would typically get in a demand-centric inflation scenario. Really, the demand is not there to really cause a lot of inflation. I think the only thing that would potentially create some blips of inflation over the next couple of months maybe is just the weakness of the sol and its pass-through effects for importers onto the price of final consumer goods. So all this to be said is we do expect inflation to be, I think, about 50 basis points higher in 2021 on average than 2020. But it should stay relatively muted just because of the uninspiring job recovery.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you, Alex. One additional question as well on this page. I know that you mentioned that political uncertainty is likely the kind of main factor that's sort of kept the sol from being able to regain the lost ground that a place like Chile has been able to regain. I was just curious to ask about the fiscal accounts factor that you've included in your drivers as well, and to what extent that might impact the trajectory of the sol this year.
Good question. Let me be clear that the fiscal account situation is a negative, probably in every country in Latin America. And Peru is planning on reducing its fiscal deficit by a pretty good amount in 2021, but in absolute terms, it's still a pretty big fiscal deficit. I can't remember off the top of my head what the exact government targets are, but overall, it's still probably going to be more than 5% of GDP. And if you have a fiscal account, a deficit that large, you need to finance it somehow. And Peru will likely finance it by issuing more debt, potentially tapping into more savings, potentially printing money. And that all is inflationary in nature, and also, creates a problem for the exchange rate markets as well. Puts downward pressure on the Peruvian sol in that equation. But I think a lot of this, you have to think about it all being relative, because if the fiscal accounts for like basically every country around the world are not great in 2021, then I don't think Peru is necessarily going to be hit harder in that regard than, say, other countries.
Yeah, agreed. And in terms of kind of filling that fiscal gap, what do you think the likelihood is that Peru will try to pursue different kind of revenue boosting measures like a tax reform?
So the big issue with tax revenue collection in Peru is the fact that 2/3 of the labor force is informal. Many of them don't pay taxes at all. You'll probably get some of them that pay sales taxes or what have you, or indirect taxes, but that's kind of the main issue. I think if there are any sort of major tax reforms in Peru, and again, I think this comes down to who ends up winning the election, by the way, then it probably would be something to try to expand the tax base and try to reduce tax evasion. The leading presidential candidate right now, Johnny Lozano, has basically said that he does want to prioritize this in terms of trying to cut down on tax evasion. I'm not sure how effective that would be, though. I think the bigger issue is that you need to bring more of the informal sector into the formal sector for them to be able to add to the tax pool. I think it's a question of broadening the tax pool and not so much deepening it. That being said, if you have someone more from the center left win the election, such as Veronica Mendoza, then potentially you would have higher taxes on, say, corporations, maybe on income taxes for those who do pay formal taxes. But you're correct in pointing out that that money does need to come from somewhere, and that is going to be a challenge for the new Peruvian government, is trying to figure out how to amplify the tax revenue stream, especially amid a context in which the Peruvian government is trying to really keep spending relatively expansionary with this COVID-19 recovery.
Right, yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. So I think this transitions really well to the other unique challenge that Peru has, which is the politics. And this is, where we are going to have quite a bit of speculation. I think we'll know a lot more about this election when it actually happens in a month. But I wanted to start by giving a little bit of context. And the context that I wanted to bring up is that the Peru's new Congress, and I should say relatively new because it was elected in January of 2020 after former President Martin Vizcarra dissolved Congress in 2019 after 2 successive no confidence votes. It produced a Congress that was extremely fragmented, which is something you can see on the inner circle of this diagram, with no one party controlling even close to a plurality of seats. You can see that Acción Popular, Alianza para el Progreso, and a few other parties here like Partido Morado also are sort of more centrist in nature. I think our initial view is that they would be a little bit more, they would play ball better with Vizcarra compared to the Fuerza Popular dominated Congress that was elected in 2016. That has not been the case. In fact, the Congress that was elected in January 2020 has been even more obstructionist to policy since 2020. And I would argue that, a lot of what happened last year and a lot of the fears of populism that are coming out of Peru have really stemmed from this Congress, where their actions have been very difficult to monitor, even on a week-by-week basis. And really, all of this culminated in the continuation or even a renewal of a political crisis that began in 2019 and resulted in a failed impeachment attempt of President Vizcarra in September of 2020. And during this moment, it seemed pretty clear to us that there probably wasn't a good chance of Vizcarra being impeached in a base case scenario, just based on the fact that many of these congressmen and women specifically said that they didn't want to create a political crisis on top of an economic and a social crisis. But it seemed pretty clear that the noise reached a deafening level. And once it became released that President Vizcarra was involved, allegedly involved, I should say, since the case is still ongoing, with some illicit contracts when he was governor of his home province, then the vote was no longer in his favor, and he was successfully removed in October of 2020. And this really caused an unprecedented political crisis in Peru, where you had the Speaker of Congress take over as president because there were no vice presidents because of just the nature of Martín Vizcarra's presidency. Manuel Merino, who was the president of Congress, took over as president of the Republic for about a week. Massive protests basically pushed him out of office. And you had the president of the Partido Morado party, President Sagasti, who is, well, I should say he's now President Sagasti, took over as president for Manuel Merino, and a very close to a unanimous vote in Congress, which was good, and that has basically solved the political crisis for now. Obviously, this is basically a government that's basically keeping watch of the country effectively until there are new elections, which take place in April. So the real question is, will this end up affecting the elections that take place in April? The answer is likely it will. And I think that even though it's very early to tell who will end up winning these elections, one thing I can say is that I think the thing that is really on top of investors' minds right now is whether or not the Peruvian politics will start dominating the economic outlook. Because in Peru, for the last 20 years, notwithstanding the big recession that we had last year, we effectively had 2 decades of consecutive growth. Ever since Alberto Fujimori was president of the country in 1990, we had a couple of years of recession at the beginning of his administration. After that, we pretty much had 2 straight decades, almost 3 straight decades of consecutive growth. Despite the fact that you have basically everyone since Fujimori, including Fujimori, under investigation for corruption, in jail already, or dead. And not to be grim about this, it's just the truth, where you had political risk consistently in Peru, but you never actually had it derail the economic performance. Is this time different? Potentially, because what we have right now is what we can say certainly will likely be a fragmented Congress. I think the latest voter intentions show that there is a little bit of momentum for Acción Popular and Yoni Lescano, who is their candidate, which could potentially create a slightly more governable executive and legislative branch starting in June of 2021. But that being said, there are a lot of populist ideas that are on the table that have clearly derailed the stability of the Peruvian sol and investment intentions to Peru over the last couple of months. So will Yanis Lescano, if he were to be elected, end up being more of a centrist operator, pro-markets, having decent amount of governability, and importantly, not a high risk of just getting impeached? Then I think that will end up having a lot of impact on how we end up seeing Peru's medium to long-term economic outlook. So returning back to the polls, what we can see in these 2 charts is an evolution of polls over the last couple of months. George Forsyth, who is the center-right former mayor of La Victoria, just outside of Lima, has lost a lot of his momentum. He was the favorite in voter intentions for most of the end of last year. And momentum clearly is playing a big role here, because on the other side of that momentum coin, you can see Yoni Lescano, who has really substantially increased his first round voting intentions. And it seems pretty clear that he is likely to reach a second round, unless the polls are just completely wrong, which is entirely possible. The other person I think to keep watch here is Lopez Aliaga, who really was not even polling at all at the end of 2020, and has all of a sudden come close to capturing about 10% of the intended vote. He's more of your ultra-conservative candidates, a little bit anti-establishment, but does try to differentiate himself from other of the uber-right candidates in the region, such as Jair Bolsonaro. He does want to come across as this pro-business candidate and not trying to talk too much about his social beliefs. So that could end up being a potential runoff scenario. But in a runoff scenario, this is kind of where we start seeing Lescano having probably the best chance to win this election, because one-on-one in this poll against Veronica Mendoza, Lopez Arriaga, Keiko Fujimori, you can see that Lescano basically crushes them all in a runoff. And the only person where there is a bit of a competitive streak with is Forsyth. And interesting, I think the reason why Forsyth is a competitive candidate for Lescano is because they're both pretty centrists in terms of their ideological leanings. And it would be kind of interesting to see how those further on the right and those further on the left ideologically would vote for Lescano versus Forsyth in such a runoff, because they are somewhat similar in their platforms. So it will be interesting to see how this turns out. I think at this point, if I were to make a call, I would say Lescano has the best chance of winning, and I would probably categorize him as being a relatively pro-market populist with an established party who probably will keep some policy continuity as far as the macroeconomic policy framework is concerned. And there's not a huge risk of him going totally off the rails. On the other hand, his party, Acción Popular, is the party of Manuel Merino, who is accused of, rightfully or wrongly impeaching Martín Vizcarra last year. And a lot of people are not exactly big fans of Acción Popular during that time and Manuel Merino during that time, which is the reason why we had protests. So it'll be interesting to see if and how Lescano continues to differentiate himself from that faction of Acción Popular, as well as that faction, or I should say specifically Manuel Merino, which he's been able to successfully do clearly in the polling. So again, very uncertain couple of months, and I think it's interesting to see that even with 1 month to go before this election, it's very uncertain about who's going to make it to the second round, especially if we think about other elections that have taken place in the region over the last couple of years where there's clearly been a top two favorite. Any questions about any of this, Mariana? I know there's a lot of speculation, a lot of things that we can talk about here, but I want to make sure that I cover all of your questions and doubts.
Yes, I do have a quick question. So as you can see in the previous slide, the polling numbers have changed quite dramatically over the past few months. So I was curious to hear your views on how Lescano has really been able to kind of achieve this level of popular support, or I guess just voter intention. I know you mentioned that momentum was playing a big factor, but I wondered if there was anything else that had kind of catapulted him to the levels where he is now.
That's a really good question. I think part of this has coming from a pretty established party, Acción Popular, which has been around even before Alberto Fujimori, whereas a lot of these other parties are very new or were kind of back from the dead, like Frepap. And I think he was able to utilize that platform, but recognize that that platform was a little tainted because of Acción Popular's role in the political crisis from last year. And he was able to very clearly say that Manuel Merino was a traitor for doing that or whatever. I mean, he's basically like completely distanced himself from Merino. And also, I think that Peruvians buy into his policy proposals. Particularly, he's a big fan of trying to completely revamp the pension system to try to create universal basic pensions. And I think that's something that is really resonating with Peruvians. And he's also very much a no-nonsense anti-corruption candidate. Granted, you could argue that a lot of people on this list are trying to vie for the anti-corruption vote. So overall, I think it's created a relatively compelling package. And again, I think that he is a relatively populist, charismatic speaker as well, which I think does play true to kind of the anti-establishment sentiment that's floating around the country.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And the other thing that I was wondering about is Congress. So we can see on the chart on the right kind of voter intentions by party. And I know you mentioned that this current Congress is one of the most fragmented Peru has seen. So I was wondering if you think that Congress will look just as fragmented, or is there a chance that kind of one party or a couple of parties will be able to regain some lost ground?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I mean, if we were looking at like February's polling here, the dark blue bar, I think my answer to you would definitely be that we'll likely see just as fragmented as a Congress in this 2021 election as we did in the 2020 election. I think that the momentum for Acción Popular and for Lescano is really helping those these two people and Acción Popular's case institution play off each other. And if Lescano continues to poll really well, I think Acción Popular will also benefit from that, and vice versa. All this to be said is that Acción Popular could get pretty close to getting to maybe like a third of the seats in Congress, even though we're still at only 15%, according to this poll. It wouldn't surprise me if Acción Popular does pick up more seats than what they have now. I should say they are currently the largest party in Progress, not by much, but they are still the largest party. And if you have a president win or competitive from your platform, then that does help your potential of picking up seats. So you could have Acción Popular win a decent amount of seats. And within the current Congress, you've had Acción Popular work together pretty closely with Alianza para el Progreso and a few of the other more center-right parties. So they could have a decently workable coalition, as opposed to this year, or I should say last year, when you had Vizcarra, who was independent, basically battling against all of these disparate parties and wasn't really able to work together well with any of them, and there was no real coalition going. So I do think that if there is some sort of plurality with Acción Popular and Lescano's in president, then there will be a much better governing ability than in 2020.
Thank you, Alex.
Great. So finishing off the presentation, I wanted to share with you our scenarios and then give you a quick consumer spending outlook. I'll show you these former scenarios that we have for Peru, where you can see our downside scenario clearly called for Vizcarra to be impeached. That happened. So now what we're looking at is the elections in 2021, and as well as the copper story, as well as the vaccination story. I think that there are a lot of different weighing factors that are going on this page right now based on everything that I've said. I think from the domestic COVID-19 containment story, I think we're clearly looking at more of a downside scenario right now, just because the vaccination process has been slow, but you've seen renewed lockdowns in certain states, or I should say regions in the country, such as the Lima metro area. And you've also, basically seen that Peru has not done a very good job tackling the secondary outbreak. On the upside, copper is above this $8,000 per metric ton level right now, so that will end up, creating kind of a mitigating factor for the short-term shortcomings to the economy, given these lockdowns. And then from a political standpoint, I think what we're looking at right now is that Sagasti definitely is having a relatively tense relationship with Congress. They're not really getting anything done, and there's a lot of populist proposals in Congress that are getting sent to the Constitutional Court. It's clear that there's not going to be anything major to happen, such as a pension reform or potentially even a new constitution until we have a new government. But with regards to those elections, I think it's likely that we see a relatively pro-market candidate win, but deal with a relatively fragmented Congress. Here's where like maybe we have a little bit more up bias to the upside too, at least with regards to governability, because if Lescano, as I was just explaining to you, does end up winning a decent amount of seats via Acción Popular in Congress, then potentially he does manage to form a working coalition in Congress, and you have this upside governability scenario. I think if that were to happen, it really comes down to what are his priorities and what are his true platforms, which are two things that are a little bit uncertain at this moment. And then as far as protests or social unrest go, we've seen mild pockets of protests, not just after Vizcarra's impeachment, but around an agrarian law and certain mining projects. So we should still expect those to remain in place, especially if the labor market recovery is slow to pick up. And if we're looking at the longer term forecast, you can see that we do expect a very strong rebound in 2021. Most of this is because of base effects. It's pretty easy to achieve a high level of growth when you declined by a negative 11.1% the previous year. And then we'll expect a moderation of growth of 2% in 2022 and a little bit above 3% for 2023 through 2025. As for the sol, as I mentioned earlier, probably a pretty strong depreciation on average in 2021 compared to 2020, but that should be a tale of 2 years where you do start to see the sol appreciate over the course of the year. And of course, the other scenarios sort of reflect this as well, where on the downside, we expect a consistently weak sol, and the upside, we expect the sol to appreciate pretty strongly back to where it was before COVID in our forecasting period. Any questions about the scenarios, Mariana?
Quick question here. So something that I noticed you discussed earlier and then kind of comes up in your base case here is kind of Sagasti having a tense relationship with Congress, but satisfying civil society, and this kind of disconnect between what's going on in Congress and where popular opinion lies. Is this sort of a common trend in Peru, or is this something that you expect to kind of continue? I know largely that will depend on who is elected, but I'd be curious to hear what your thoughts are on that.
It's a common recent trend. Ever since PPK was elected in 2016, he had to deal with a majority from Fuerza Popular, which was the party of his opponent in the second round, Keiko Fujimori. They were pretty obstructionist, ultimately caused PPK to resign for alleged corruption allegations. And ever since his vice president, who is Martin Vizcarra, took over, there was also a lot of discontent or malcontent between Congress and the executive. And that pretty much categorized the relationship between him and Congress until he ultimately was forced to vacate the office. The interesting thing about Vizcarra, and this doesn't relate to Sagasti too much, but Vizcarra was wildly popular and had approval ratings of above 50% for most of the time he was president, and even was higher than 70% during the peak of the coronavirus pandemic. So it was kind of weird to see this dichotomy of a Congress just really not getting along with the president. And it's something similar to what we've seen with Sagasti too, where Sagasti at least has congressional representation through Partido Morado. But on the other hand, Congress is still clearly trying to change a lot of the rules with regards to pension withdrawals and what have you. And Sagasti's not exactly supportive of these measures. So you do still have a relatively tense relationship. And I think that maybe what is making me have a little bit of a glass half full view of Lescano is if he does end up having a decent relationship with Congress, is like at least you'll get stuff done. At least you won't have the threats of an impeachment. And by the way, there were some rumors that Sagasti would be put under impeachment proceedings for the Vacuna Gates situation that we had in Peru, even though he had nothing to do with it. So overall, the relationship with Congress has been very, very critical for Peru's political recent history. And it's also extremely critical for Peru's outlook going forward.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you, Alex.
Great. So lastly, just to finish up with some consumer comments, I did want to reiterate that really the main thing that's driving consumption in a positive way are pension withdrawals. We saw two separate private pension withdrawals last year. Congress just approved another one, which is going to go before the Constitutional Committee, and there's been a whole bunch of other things that I've been dealing with pensions that have honestly been kind of tough to keep track of because one of them was shot down for being unconstitutional. Long story short is that these did help with consumer spending towards the end of last year. It will likely supplement consumer spending at least a little bit in the first quarter of 2021. Meanwhile, credit demand is soft. Labor market is going to be weakened. And if you look at this page, you basically see the trend of people taking billions of soles out of private pension accounts halfway through the year, and as well as at the beginning of this year. And this clearly had a really positive impact on consumer spending in the second half of 2020. I keep saying this when I talk about Chile. I'll say the same thing when I'm talking about Peru. Beware of the hangover effect of this sugar rush. Because once this wears off, if you still have the employment story being stalled out as it is, we should probably see a decline in consumer spending on a quarter-on-quarter basis, so long as that is the case. Because if we're looking at credit, which is the other key element to the consumer spending story, generally speaking, you can see that despite the fact that consumer lending rates are very low, consumer credit, both in US dollars and in soles, has been declining really ever since the beginning of the pandemic. Clearly, the Reactiva Peru initiative that the government had about government-sponsored credits really only has gone to businesses. And you can see that, I mean, there is an other side of the coin is that you've seen credit go to businesses really strongly, which will likely help investments. That's great. But if we're just talking about consumer spending, consumer credit has been very much lagging behind on the credit story, and is definitely something that will probably end up causing downward pressure to consumer spending, again, on a quarter-on-quarter basis throughout the course of the year. Overall, once we get a consumer spending, or to get a consumer spending story recovery, we're going to need employment recovery. We're going to need wages to recover. Credit is going to need to reverse a little bit, or else you're not to see this high level of consumer spending, at least in absolute terms, continue. So I believe this is the last slide that I have prepared for today. Mariana, I wanted to see if you had any questions about Peru's consumer spending story, or if you just had any lingering questions at all that I could answer in the moments that we have remaining.
Yes. So the last question I'd like to ask, and you've covered a little bit of this as well, is kind of your view on consumption as the fiscal stimulus starts to fade. I know it wasn't necessarily kind of as the portions of the fiscal stimulus package weren't necessarily as oriented towards consumers. But I would be curious to see how you see that play out on a quarterly basis.
Yeah, I think that the main thing is that if we're looking at this page here, it seems likely that we're going to see a dip in this line during the first 2 quarters of this year as the pensions start to wear off a little bit. Especially given the fact that we are in the middle of a more strict social distancing situation than we were in Q4 of 2020. So overall, again, I think you'll probably see a dip and then more of a flat line over the course of the year. It's important to keep in mind that compared to Q2 of 2020, the 2021 is probably going to look good, at least if we're just looking at percentage change. But I do think that the consumer spending recovery in Peru will be, let's just say, rather complicated just because of the lack of employment recovery and the fact that the fiscal stimulus was not really put into the direct hands of consumers, either through credit or through bonuses.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much, Alex. This was fantastic.
Thank you.